March 20th, 1945. Camp Wheeler,
Must be
Iowa.
vigilant. The enemy
Four
is
German
watching.
women sat
What are our
frozen at a
orders,
corner
sir?
table in the
Complete
mess
the
hall,
reports.
staring at
No
something
delay.
they had not seen in 3
Headquarters, this is
years.
Outpost. Report
Butter.
status.
Real butter.
Understood. Mobilize.
Anna Brenner's hand trembled as she picked up her spoon. Not the bread, not the knife, the spoon. She dipped it directly into the pale yellow square and brought it to her mouth. The taste exploded across her senses. Rich, creamy, everything the coal tar margarine had never been. Tears streamed down her face as she reached for another spoonful, then another. Beside her, Greta Fischer, Clara Hoffman, and Rosa Klein did the same. 4 enemy prisoners eating butter like soup, weeping like their hearts were breaking. The American mess hall fell silent, 50 soldiers watching in stunned horror. This was not bad manners. This was starvation revealing itself in the presence of plenty. If you or your family members served during World War II and encountered German prisoners of war, share your memories in the comments below. This is a story that needs to be told. How did 4 enemy soldiers end up eating butter by the spoonful in an Iowa prison camp? And why did this simple breakfast break them so completely? The answer begins 3 years earlier with a birthday cake, and the last real butter Anna Brenner would taste for a very long time. Hamburg, Germany, spring 1942. The apartment on Rothenbaum Chaussee had survived the first British bombing raids, though buildings on either end of the block had not. Anna stood in her mother's kitchen, watching the careful ritual of celebration in a time when celebration had become dangerous. Her younger sister, Lotte, was turning 16. Their mother, Frau Brenner, stood at the counter with a small, wrapped package in her trembling hands. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing butter wrapped in damp cloth, real butter. Actual cream from actual cows, churned and salted, and precious beyond measure. She had kept it hidden in the coolest corner of their cellar for 6 weeks, saving a few grams from each ration card allocation, hoarding it grain by grain for this moment. Anna watched her mother measure out the butter with the kind of care usually reserved for gold or medicine. Each gram mattered. Each gram represented sacrifice from every other meal, every other day. The butter went into cake batter along with eggs that had been similarly hoarded flour that was still real wheat without adulterant sugar that had not yet been replaced with saccharin substitutes. Frau Brenner worked with the focused intensity of someone who knew this might be the last time she could offer her daughter such a gift. The cake baked slowly in their small oven while Anna and Lotte sat at the kitchen table not speaking, just breathing in the impossible smell of butter and sugar and normalcy. When it emerged golden and perfect, their mother cut it into 12 impossibly thin slices so that everyone in their building could have a taste. Neighbors who had shared in the hoarding. Neighbors who remembered when birthday cakes were ordinary instead of miraculous. Anna took her slice with both hands. She bit into it slowly, trying to memorize everything. The way butter melted on her tongue, the tender crumb of real cake, the sweetness that was not chemical. She closed her eyes and tried to burn this memory into her brain because somewhere deep in her 19-year-old heart, she knew. This was the last time. She had no way of knowing this memory would haunt her for 3 years. She had no way of knowing that when she finally tasted butter again, it would be in enemy territory served by the very people she had been taught to fear and hate. But first, Anna had to survive the descent into starvation that was about to consume Germany. Let me explain what was really happening to German soldiers and civilians during these years. Facts that most Germans never knew until it was too late. In 1942, the rationing system still functioned with some reliability. Families received their allotted portions of meat, eggs, milk, and fats, according to carefully calculated schedules. The amounts were smaller than before the war, certainly. But people adapted. They learned to stretch ingredients, to make one chicken feed a family of 6, to add water to milk to make it last longer. Life was harder but manageable. Then the system began to collapse. By 1943, Allied bombing of transportation networks meant supplies could not reach cities reliably. The German military consumed the best of everything, leaving civilians with progressively worse substitutes. Coffee disappeared, replaced with ersatz coffee made from roasted barley and chicory root that tasted like burned dirt and left a coating on the tongue. Bread became heavy with sawdust fillers so dense it sat in the stomach like a stone. The substance they called butter bore no resemblance to the real thing. It was margarine manufactured from coal tar derivatives, colored yellow, with chemical dye possessed of a taste that made eating it an act of willpower rather than nourishment. That year, Anna Brenner joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps. She was 20 years old, motivated partly by patriotic duty, as the propaganda posters urged, but also by practical calculation. The Corps promised regular meals for its members. Her family could manage better with one less mouth to feed. She could send portions of her rations home when possible. The recruitment officers had made it sound almost appealing. The reality proved grimmer. Anna became a radio operator stationed with communications units that moved behind advancing German lines. The work was demanding, the hours long, but it was the food that shocked her. Breakfast consisted of that terrible ersatz coffee, accompanied by a slice of dark bread so heavy with non-food fillers that it required genuine effort to chew and swallow. Sometimes the bread was spread with the chemical margarine. Anna learned to eat it without tasting, to think of it as fuel rather than food. Lunch brought thin soup, usually made from turnips or potatoes, occasionally enhanced with a few scraps of vegetables or the barest hint of meat fat. Anna learned to eat slowly, to make each spoonful last, to trick her stomach into feeling more satisfied than the meager portions warranted. Dinner offered more of the same dark bread, sometimes with a small portion of cheese that was more filler than dairy, or a serving of boiled potatoes when they were available. On rare occasions, perhaps once every few weeks, they received a thin slice of sausage that was more grain and mystery ingredients than actual meat. Anna learned to live with constant gnawing hunger. It became as familiar as breathing, a sensation she woke with and went to sleep with and carried through every moment of every day. She learned to supplement official rations however she could. In spring, she foraged for wild greens. She gathered acorns to grind into flour substitutes. She traded favors and possessions for extra food whenever the opportunity arose. In the summer of 1943, Anna bartered her only pair of civilian shoes for 2 eggs and a small jar of real honey from a farmer near their posting. She ate one egg immediately, standing alone in the barracks kitchen, savoring every single bite like it was a religious experience. The other egg and half the honey she wrapped carefully and sent home to Lotta in a package that took 6 weeks to arrive and might have been opened and pilfered a dozen times along the way. She never knew if Lotta received it. By 1944, even these inadequate rations became irregular. While Anna and her fellow soldiers starved, Hermann Goering sat in his luxurious hunting lodge, eating venison and drinking fine wine. The Nazi elite never missed a meal. They sent others to die hungry while they feasted on the spoils of conquest. The rationing was not because Germany lacked food. It was because the leaders had decided who deserved to eat. Supply lines disrupted by Allied bombing meant days would pass with nothing but stale bread and water, flavored with a few grains of the hated ersatz coffee. Anna's uniform hung loose on her frame. Her cheekbones became prominent. Her wrist grew thin enough that her watch, a graduation gift from her father who had died in 1940, slipped constantly down her arm. She punched new holes in her belt, then punched them again. Her body consumed itself for fuel, burning through muscle and fat reserves that had been modest to begin with. In November 1944, Anna stood at her radio post in a commandeered farmhouse outside Metz, France, and realized she could see the bones in the back of her hands. She was 23 years old and looked 40. Her reflection in windows startled her. Hollow cheeks, dull eyes, skin stretched tight over skull. She was starving. They were all starving. The entire German army was starving, while their leaders ate meat and butter in underground bunkers and told them victory was certain. The end came faster than anyone expected. Allied forces advanced through France with devastating speed, cutting through defensive positions that commanders had promised would hold for weeks. Anna's communications unit maintained radio contact with scattered Wehrmacht units as the front collapsed around them like a house of cards. The order to evacuate came too late. American forces had already encircled their position, cutting off the escape route to the east. Anna remembered the strange silence that fell over their unit when they realized there was nowhere left to run. No fallback position, no reinforcements coming, no miracle rescue. Her commanding officer, Captain Dietrich, was a weary man who had lost his enthusiasm for the war somewhere in the brutal Russian winter of 1942. He had survived that frozen hell only to find himself trapped in France with no ammunition, no supplies, and no hope. He stood in the farmhouse doorway for a long moment, looking out at the American positions surrounding them. Then he simply set down his pistol and walked out with his hands raised. The rest of them followed. The American soldiers who took them prisoner were younger than Anna had expected. Many looked barely old enough to shave. They searched the women for weapons with professional efficiency, but without the brutality propaganda had promised. They were not monsters. They were boys doing a job they had been trained to do. One soldier, noticing Greta Fisher shivering in the November cold, draped his own jacket over her shoulders. Greta stood frozen, unable to comprehend the gesture. The enemy was supposed to be cruel, savage, inhumane. That was what the propaganda had told them for years. That was what justified everything. And yet this American boy, this enemy, had given her his jacket. Anna watched Greta's face cycle through confusion, suspicion, and finally something close to wonder. It was the first crack in the wall of certainty they had all built around themselves. They were processed through a series of temporary camps in France, each move bringing them farther from home and deeper into uncertainty. The propaganda they had absorbed for years painted vivid pictures of American cruelty. Prisoners worked to death in mines, prisoners shot for sport, prisoners starved deliberately as revenge for German aggression. Yet each camp contradicted these expectations. They received medical examinations. A doctor looked at Anna's malnourished frame and prescribed vitamin supplements. Their worn shoes were replaced with sturdy boots that actually fit. They were deloused and given clean clothes. Not their auxiliary uniforms, but simple dresses that hung loose on their undernourished frames but were whole and clean and free of lice. The ocean crossing in January 1945 was Anna's first time on a ship. The converted transport vessel carried hundreds of prisoners in cramped conditions below deck. The crossing took 2 weeks through winter storms that left most of them seasick and miserable. But even there, even in those crowded holds, the treatment defied everything they had been taught to expect. They received 2 meals daily, simple food but more substantial than what they had eaten in Germany. The bread was white, made from real wheat flour, without sawdust filler. There was soup with actual vegetables floating in the broth, not just colored water with a few turnip scraps. Sometimes there was cheese, sometimes there was fruit. Rosa Klein cried the first time she tasted the ship's bread. She was 18 years old, the youngest of them all, and she bit into white bread that tasted like bread instead of sawdust and chemicals, and she cried like a child. The taste was a betrayal of everything she had been told. Their own government had been feeding them worse than the Americans fed their prisoners. What did that mean? What did any of it mean? Clara Hoffman told her sharply to stop crying, that showing weakness would only encourage their captors. But Anna saw tears in Clara's eyes too. They all tasted the same betrayal in that white bread. They all felt the same terrible questions beginning to form. From New York, they traveled by train across American vastness. The journey took 3 days, and Anna spent hours at the window watching landscape pass. Farmland stretched for miles without visible bomb damage. Fields lay fallow for winter but intact, waiting for spring planting. Towns showed no signs of the destruction that had become normal in Germany. No rubble, no burned-out buildings, no empty lots where homes used to stand. Factories operated with lights blazing even at night, unconcerned about air raids that would never come. Cities glowed against the darkness, advertisements, and streetlights in normalcy that seemed impossible after years of blackouts. The disconnect between what she was seeing and what she had been told about American weakness left Anna struggling to reconcile two incompatible realities. They had been assured that the United States was on the brink of collapse, that American people were starving while their government wasted resources on a war that did not concern them, that German discipline and efficiency would inevitably triumph over American chaos. But here was the truth rolling past her window, mile after mile of it, undamaged, productive, abundant, still fighting and showing no signs of exhaustion. Everything had been a lie. What was it like seeing America for the first time after years of war? If you came to this country as an immigrant or refugee, or remember your parents' stories of arrival, share your memories in the comments below. These first-hand accounts matter. The train pulled into Iowa on a cold morning in mid-March. Anna pressed her face to the window and watched endless flat land under endless sky. The emptiness was almost frightening after the crowded cities of Germany. Space. So much space. Land that stretched to horizons unbroken by anything but the curve of the earth itself. The truck ride to Camp Wheeler was short. When they climbed down from the canvas-covered transport, Anna's first thought was how clean everything looked. Wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, gravel paths raked smooth, watchtowers standing sentinel against a pale Midwestern sky, an American flag snapping in the cold wind. This was enemy territory. This was where the propaganda promised they would suffer for their nation's sins. Captain Dorothy Morrison stood waiting. She was a woman in her mid-40s with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore her uniform with the kind of authority that transcended gender, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the compound. You will be processed and assigned to barracks. You will follow camp regulations. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. She paused, studying the four exhausted women before her, with an expression Anna could not read. Not hatred, not cruelty, something else. Something almost like weary professionalism. Dinner is served at 1800 hours in the mess hall. You are expected to attend. The word dinner seemed almost absurd to Anna. In Germany, dinner had long since become whatever scraps could be found or stretched into something resembling a meal. The rations for auxiliary corps members had been meager even before the final collapse. Real meat had disappeared from their tables 2 years ago. Butter had become a memory so distant it seemed like something from childhood fairy tales. They were led to a barracks that shocked them with its cleanliness. Real beds with mattresses, not straw pallets. Blankets that looked thick and warm. A stove in the corner that suggested heat would be available when needed. Windows that had glass in them whole and unbroken. Anna and Greta exchanged glances. Both women were afraid to believe what they were seeing. This had to be temporary. A cruel trick before the real punishment began. No one treated enemy prisoners this well. It made no sense. It contradicted everything. They sat on their assigned bunks and waited for reality to reassert itself. For guards to come and drag them to work details or cells or whatever Americans did to German prisoners. But as the afternoon faded and the dinner hour approached, no punishment materialized. No one came except Sergeant Patterson, appearing at their door with a neutral expression. Mess hall is that building there. You should come now. It was spring of 1942, 3 years before her capture when Anna Brenner had last seen real butter. That moment in her mother's kitchen with Lotte's birthday cake. She had tried so hard to memorize the taste to preserve it somehow against the hunger she knew was coming. But memory fades. 3 years of chemical margarine and deprivation had eroded that precious recollection until she could no longer quite remember what real butter tasted like. Until now. The four women walked across the compound toward the mess hall as the dinner hour approached. Sergeant Patterson led the way, his boots crunching on gravel, saying nothing. Anna watched his broad back and weathered neck and tried to understand what kind of man would guard enemy prisoners with such studied neutrality. Not cruel, not kind, just doing a job. The smell hit them before they reached the door. Real food, actual cooking that involved more than boiling turnips in water. Anna's stomach clenched with sudden, painful hunger, so intense it was almost nausea. Beside her, Greta made a small sound in her throat. Rose's hands trembled. Even Clara, who maintained iron discipline through everything, faltered in her step. Patterson held the door open, gestured them inside without meeting their eyes. The mess hall was longer than Anna had expected, with rows of wooden tables already filling with the American soldiers and staff. The windows were clean, the floor was swept. Everything spoke of order and routine and normalcy that seemed impossible after years of chaos. But it was the people that caught her attention. American men in clean uniforms sitting down to dinner. Like this was nothing special. Like abundance was ordinary. They ate and talked and laughed. Some of them glanced at the German women entering their space, curious but not hostile. Most ignored them entirely, focused on their own meals and conversations. Corporal James Bennett stood near the serving line with a clipboard in his hands. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the build of someone who had done physical labor all his life. When he saw the four women, he nodded once and gestured toward an empty table at the back of the hall. "Sit there. Someone will bring your trays." His voice was neither warm nor cold. Professional. Anna led the way to the designated table, acutely aware of eyes following them. The enemy in their midst. German women who had fought against America and lost. The table was clean. The benches were sturdy. But what caught Anna's attention, what made her breath catch in her throat, were the small dishes already placed at each setting. In each dish sat a pale yellow square, perhaps 2 inches across. The morning light from the windows caught it, making it gleam softly. Anna stared. Her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. This could not be real. This had to be some kind of mistake or trick or hallucination brought on by months of malnutrition. Butter, real butter. Beside her, Greta had gone completely still. Clara leaned forward slightly, as if confirming with closer inspection that her eyes were not deceiving her. Rosa reached out one trembling finger, then pulled it back, afraid to touch something that could not possibly be real. Private Sarah Mitchell approached their table carrying a tray laden with plates. She was a sturdy woman in her mid-20s with red hair pulled back under her cap and freckles scattered across her nose like someone had flicked a paintbrush at her face. Her movements were efficient, practiced the actions of someone who had served hundreds of meals and thought nothing of it. She set down plates in front of each woman. What Anna saw on those plates made the butter seem almost reasonable by comparison. 2 eggs, their yolks golden and perfectly intact. 3 strips of bacon, actual meat glistening with fat. A thick slice of white bread still warm enough that steam rose faintly from it. A cup of coffee that smelled like real coffee beans, not the hated ersatz substitute that had poisoned every breakfast for 3 years. And in the center of the table, a larger dish containing more butter. Much more. For a long moment, none of the 4 women moved. They sat frozen before their plates, staring at food that seemed to belong to a dream or a memory from before the war. Around them, American soldiers and staff ate their own breakfast with casual indifference, treating this abundance as nothing more than ordinary routine. Normal, expected, not worth commenting on. But Anna watched a young soldier at the next table spread butter thickly on his bread, take 2 bites and leave the rest on his plate as he stood to leave. The waste of it made something twist painfully in her chest. That discarded bread with its generous smear of butter represented more fat than she had consumed in a month back in Germany, more nutrition than an entire week's rations. And he just left it there. Rosa saw it too. Anna heard her sharp intake of breath, saw her hands clench into fists. The youngest of them, Rosa, still believed in the righteousness of their cause, still thought Germany had been right and America wrong, still clung to propaganda even as reality dismantled it piece by piece. See, Rosa whispered in German, her voice shaking. They have so much they wasted while we starved. But the anger in her voice was undercut by something else, something that sounded almost like despair. Anna looked down at her own plate, at eggs that would have fed her family for a day, at bacon that represented a luxury she had not tasted in years, at bread made from real wheat by people who had never known hunger. Her hands began to shake. Across the mess hall, Sergeant Frank Patterson stood near the door with his arms crossed watching. His face showed nothing, no sympathy, no contempt, just observation. But inside his mind was working. Patterson was 52 years old. He had been born in 1893 on a farm outside Des Moines, during a time when America itself was still finding its footing. His earliest memories were of his mother's hands always working, always moving, trying to make enough from too little. His father had died when Frank was 6, leaving his mother alone with 4 children and a farm that barely produced enough to keep them alive. He remembered hunger, not the dramatic starvation of war, but the grinding chronic hunger of poverty. The way his stomach always felt hollow, the way he learned to ignore it because there was nothing to be done, the way his mother cut their bread into thinner and thinner slices, trying to make it last, her face drawn and tired and old before her time. He remembered the winter of 1901 when they had turnip soup for Christmas because there was nothing else. His mother had tried to make it festive, had put the soup in their good bowls and said grace with extra fervor, but Frank had been 8 years old and he had cried because he was so hungry and the soup was so thin and he wanted meat just once, just a little bit of meat. His mother had held him and told him to be grateful for what they had, that there were people starving in the streets of New York, that they were lucky to have a roof and a farm and each other. But Frank had still been hungry. He had joined the army in 1917, shipped off to France to fight in the First War. He had seen things there that haunted him still. Bodies in mud, gas attacks, boys younger than him dying in ways that made no sense. But one thing he remembered clearly was the food. Army rations had been the best meals of his life up to that point. Regular, sufficient, more than he had eaten growing up. After the war, he had come back to Iowa and bought his own farm with his service pay. He had married a good woman named Margaret, who knew how to stretch $1 and a pound of flour further than seemed possible. They had raised 3 children through the Depression, through droughts and dust storms, and years when the bank threatened to take the farm. But they had always had food. Not much sometimes. Not fancy, but enough. His children had never gone to bed with their stomachs hurting from emptiness, the way his had. When the draft notice came in 1944, Frank had been too old for combat. They put him in the Guard service, assigned him to Camp Wheeler to watch over prisoners of war. German prisoners. The enemy. Men and now women who had fought to destroy everything America stood for. He had expected to hate them. But standing in the mess hall doorway, watching 4 starving women stare at butter like it was a miracle, Frank Patterson did not feel hate. He felt something uncomfortably close to recognition. He knew what it looked like when someone had been hungry too long. He knew the hollow eyes and sharp cheekbones. He knew the way hands trembled when real food appeared. He had seen it in the mirror as a child. He had seen it in his mother's face. These women were the enemy. But they were also just people who had been starved by their own government and lied to about everything. And now they were about to break. The 4 women sat frozen, staring at butter and eggs and bacon. Years of starvation confronting impossible abundance. Then Greta's control broke. She reached for her spoon. What happened next would shock everyone in that mess hall and reveal a truth about deprivation that most Americans had never witnessed. Then Patterson spoke. His voice was gruff, carrying clearly across the silent mess hall. "Finish your breakfast, all of it. That is an order." Anna looked down at her plate. The eggs had gone cold. The bacon was congealing in its own fat. Her stomach, shocked by the sudden influx of pure fat after years of near starvation, churned uncomfortably. The thought of eating more made her feel sick. But an order was an order, and obeying orders was something she understood. She picked up her fork and began to eat, forcing down food her body desperately needed but could barely process. The eggs tasted like ambrosia despite being cold. Rich, dense, real protein. The bacon was salty and fatty beyond anything she remembered. Even the bread, plain white bread without the butter they had already devoured, seemed impossibly luxurious. The other women did the same. They ate in silence, unable to meet each other's eyes or the eyes of anyone else in the mess hall. Every bite was shame mixed with desperate need. Every swallow was humiliation mixed with involuntary gratitude. When they finally finished, they sat waiting for instructions, for judgment, for whatever consequences would follow their shameful behavior. But Patterson just nodded toward the door. His voice remained neutral, professional, revealing nothing. "Back to your barracks. Work assignments will be posted after lunch." They filed out of the mess hall with their heads down, unable to look at the Americans they passed. Anna felt the weight of their stares. Imagine the contempt they must feel for these pathetic German women who had eaten butter by the spoonful like starving dogs. The walk back to their barracks seemed endless. The Iowa morning continued its cheerful brightness, indifferent to their shame. Birds sang, the sun shone. Somewhere in the distance, someone was whistling. Normal life? American life, proceeding as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside their barracks, the 4 of them sat on their bunks without speaking. The silence was heavy with mortification and the uncomfortable fullness of their stomachs, trying to adjust to real food after so long without it. Rosa spoke first. Her voice was small and broken. "I could not stop myself." Clara, who had always been the strong one, the disciplined one, could not even respond. She sat with her head in her hands. Greta was crying again quietly, her shoulders shaking. Anna stared at the floor, at her hands, at anything but her companions or herself. They had come to America as prisoners of war, enemies captured in battle. They had expected harsh treatment, hard labor, perhaps even cruelty. They had been prepared for that. They understood that. But they had not been prepared for kindness, for abundance, for butter served without commentary or judgment, for the way their own deprivation would be made exposed so completely by American plenty. They had not been prepared to see how thoroughly they had been lied to, not just about the war or about the enemy, but about everything, about reality itself. Outside the camp continued its routine. Guards changed shifts. Prisoners were assigned to work details. The kitchen staff began preparing lunch. Life moved forward with the inexorable momentum of routine. Inside the women's barracks, 4 German prisoners sat with their shame in their full stomachs, in the terrible realization that everything they had believed was false. That afternoon, Captain Morrison appeared at their door with paper and pencils. Her expression was neutral, professional. Prisoners are permitted to write letters home. All correspondence will be reviewed and delivery cannot be guaranteed given the current state of affairs in Germany. But you may write if you wish. She handed each of them several sheets of paper and a pencil, then she left without another word. Anna sat on her bunk with the blank paper before her. The pencil felt strange in her hand after months without writing anything personal. She thought of Lotte, thought of her mother, thought of the apartment in Hamburg that might or might not still exist. Where were they now? Were they alive? The last letter had come in August 1944, already 6 months ago. Hamburg had been bombed repeatedly. Their neighborhood might be rubble. The people she loved might be dead. But she began writing anyway, because the need to tell someone what she had experienced was overwhelming. Dear Lotte, she wrote in German, her handwriting cramped from disuse. I do not know if this letter will ever reach you or if you are still there to receive it. I do not even know if I should tell you what I am about to write, because you will think I have lost my mind or that I am lying. But I must tell someone, and you are the only person I can imagine understanding. This morning the Americans gave us butter, real butter honestly, not the coal tar margarine we learned to choke down, but actual butter made from cream. They gave each of us our own portion, and there was more on the table as much as we wanted. I ate mine with a spoon directly from the dish like a mad woman. I could not stop myself. Greta and Clara and Rosa did the same. We must have looked like animals to them. Her hand trembled as she continued writing. But that is not the strangest part. The strangest part is that they also gave us eggs. 2 eggs each, not watered down or stretched or saved for special occasions. Just 2 eggs as if this were normal. And bacon, real meat thick with fat, and bread made from white flour without any sawdust or substitute grains, and coffee that smells like coffee. She stopped reading back what she had written. It sounded insane, like propaganda in reverse, like lies designed to demoralize rather than encourage. I know you will not believe me. I am not certain I believe it myself. How can our enemies have so much when we had so little? What were we told about their starvation and weakness? What else were we told that was not true? The question hung there on the page, unanswerable and terrible. Did your father or grandfather ever encounter German prisoners of war? Did they talk about what surprised them? What humanity did they find in the enemy? Share your family stories below. Anna set down her pencil and stared at the words she had written, at the truth she had tried to capture, at the reality that contradicted everything she had been taught. In the bunk across from her, Greta was also writing. Tears fell on her paper, smudging the ink, but she kept writing. Beside her, Clara sat with blank paper in her lap, unable to begin. Rosa had already given up her pencil, abandoned, her face turned to the wall. What could they say? How could they explain what they had experienced to people who had been taught the same lies they had believed? How could they make anyone understand that the enemy was feeding them better than their own government ever had? Outside, the afternoon lights slanted through the windows. Somewhere in the camp, American soldiers were going about their duties, making sure prisoners were fed and clothed and housed according to rules that seemed to actually mean something. Tomorrow, the butter would appear again at breakfast. And the day after that, and the day after that, it was not a trick, it was not temporary. This abundance was simply normal life in America, even in a prisoner of war camp, even during wartime. And that realization, more than anything else, was what truly broke them. The butter appeared again at breakfast the next morning, and the morning after that. By the end of their first week at Camp Wheeler, the 4 women had begun to confront an uncomfortable truth that could no longer be denied or explained away. Everything they had been told about America was a lie, not an exaggeration or a hopeful misrepresentation designed to maintain morale, a complete fabrication designed to keep them fighting for a cause that had already lost. The propaganda had painted vivid pictures of American suffering. They had been shown photographs supposedly from American cities of bread lines and desperate crowds. They had been assured that the United States was on the brink of collapse, that its people were starving, while resources were wasted on a war that did not concern them. They had been told that German discipline and efficiency would inevitably triumph over American chaos and weakness. But here was the reality. Even prisoners, enemy prisoners, who had fought against this country and lost, received more food in a single day than auxiliary corps members in Germany had seen in a week. The casual abundance was almost obscene. Soldiers left food on their plates without thought. The kitchen staff threw away scraps that would have fed a German family for days. Butter was served at every meal as if it were nothing more remarkable than water. In early June, nearly 3 months after their arrival, Captain Morrison called them to her office. They went nervously, still expecting punishment, despite all evidence to the contrary. 3 months of decent treatment had not erased years of conditioning. They filed into Morrison's small office and stood at attention waiting. Morrison gestured for them to sit. They perched on the edges of their chairs, back straight, hands folded. "I have been observing your reactions during meals," Morrison said. Her voice was measured, revealing nothing. "I have been informed about the incident on your first morning here." Anna felt shame flooding back, hot and overwhelming. "The butter? Of course, they would never forget the butter. I want you to understand something." Morrison leaned forward, her gray eyes fixed on Anna. "What you experienced that morning was not a failure of discipline on your part. It was a failure of your government to care for its own people." The words hung in the air. No one had ever spoken to them this way before. No one had addressed directly the cognitive dissonance they had been struggling with since their capture. "The United States is not perfect," Morrison continued. "We have our own problems, our own failures. But we do not starve our soldiers. We do not lie to our people about the basic realities of the war. And we do not treat prisoners the way you were led to believe you would be treated." She opened a drawer and pulled out a newspaper. The headline was in German, printed by Allied Information Services for distribution in occupied territories. She slid it across the desk toward them. "Read it. All of it." Anna picked up the paper with trembling hands. The headlines were impossible. Concentration camps discovered. Millions dead. The full scale of Nazi atrocities laid out in stark black and white. Photographs that made her stomach turn. Numbers that could not be real but were. And buried on the third page, a smaller article about Hamburg, about the bombing raids that had destroyed entire neighborhoods, about casualty estimates, about refugees fleeing west. Her hands began to shake harder. Morrison's voice softened slightly. "I need you to understand why you are being treated well here. It is not charity. It is not pity. It is because we believe in something you were told did not exist. Human dignity, the rule of law, the idea that even enemies deserve basic decency." She paused, studying Anna's face. "My brother died at Normandy. He was 28 years old, killed in the first wave on Omaha Beach. I had every reason to hate you, to hate all of you." Anna looked up, meeting Morrison's eyes for the first time. "But when I saw you that morning in the mess hall eating butter like your lives depended on it," Morrison said quietly, "I realized something. You were lied to as much as anyone. Maybe more. Your own government starved you while telling you that we were the ones suffering." Anna felt something break loose inside her chest. 3 years of control, of discipline, of holding herself together through everything shattered all at once. She began to cry. Not delicate tears, but raw, ugly sobbing that came from somewhere deep and broken. For Lotte, for her mother, for the lies, for the boys who died believing they were heroes, for the women who starved believing it was sacrifice, for everything that had been taken from them by men who never missed a meal and never told the truth. Morrison handed her a handkerchief, said nothing, just waited. When Anna finally regained some composure, Morrison spoke again. "The war in Europe ended last month. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. You will be repatriated eventually, though the process may take months. The situation in Germany is chaotic, but you will go home if that is what you choose." She let that sink in before continuing. "Or you can choose to stay. There is a program for displaced persons, for people who have no home to return to. It is not easy. There is paperwork and interviews and no guarantees. But it is possible." Anna wiped her eyes. The handkerchief smelled like American laundry soap, clean and fresh. "Think about it," Morrison said. "You do not need to decide today." 2 days later, the letter arrived from the Red Cross. Anna opened it with shaking hands, hope and dread warring in her chest. The words were brief, clinical, designed to convey information without emotion. "Your address in Hamburg destroyed in bombing raids July 1943. No survivors found at listed residence. Mother Brenner Margaret presumed deceased. Sister Brenner Charlotte No information available. Anna read it 3 times. The words did not change. Lotta, her mother, gone. She had known, of course, had suspected for months, but confirmation was different, final, real in a way that hope had allowed her to avoid. She sat on her bunk with the letter in her hands and felt nothing. Numbness. The grief would come later. Now there was only emptiness. Greta received her letter the same day. Father killed in action on the Eastern Front. Mother and siblings fled to relatives location unknown. Clara's family bakery had burned down. Her parents were in a refugee camp somewhere. Rosa's younger brother was missing, presumed dead. What did they have to return to rubble chaos? A country destroyed by the men who had lied to them. That Saturday, Private Sarah Mitchell approached Captain Morrison with an unusual request. "I would like to learn some German cooking," she said. "I thought perhaps the prisoners might be willing to teach me. In exchange, I could teach them more American recipes, help them with English." Morrison studied the young woman. Sarah Mitchell had been shaken by the butter incident, had come to Morrison's office the next day asking questions, trying to understand. Morrison recognized genuine compassion when she saw it. "Permission granted," Morrison said. "Use the kitchen on Saturday afternoons when it is less busy." The first lesson took place on a warm afternoon in late June. Anna, Greta, Clara, and Rosa gathered in the camp kitchen with Sarah Mitchell and Corporal James Bennett, who had expressed interest in anything involving food. The atmosphere was awkward at first. 3 months in the camp had made them familiar with routines, but not with genuine interaction. They were still prisoners. The Americans were still guards. The war might be over, but the reality of their situation remained. Sarah fidgeted with her apron. "I thought maybe you could show us how to make something from home. Something you miss." Clara, who had worked in her family's bakery before the war, suggested Apfelkuchen, apple cake, her grandmother's recipe. Then her face fell. "We would need butter," she said quietly. "A great deal of butter. And real eggs. And cream. We have not been able to make proper Apfelkuchen since 1941. Bennett was already moving toward the storage room. "We have all of that. How much do you need?" What followed was an afternoon that none of them would forget. Clara stood at the work counter staring at the ingredients Bennett had assembled. Real butter, a full pound of it, a dozen eggs, fresh cream, white flour without adulterants, sugar, apples, cinnamon, everything she needed and more. Her hands trembled as she reached for the butter. For 3 years she had worked with substitutes, with margarine that tasted like chemicals, with eggs stretched with water, with flour mixed with sawdust. She had learned to create something edible from nothing, to make rations feed more people than they should, to preserve dignity through deprivation. Now she had everything. Abundance, plenty. The simple ingredients her grandmother had used without thought. She began to measure butter and her hands shook so badly that Anna had to steady the bowl. The butter was soft, golden, real. Clara scooped it into the mixing bowl and felt tears starting. Not again, she thought, not more crying, but she could not stop. She cracked eggs without having to dilute them with water. She poured cream without calculating how to make it last. She measured flour that was pure and white and smelled like wheat instead of wood pulp. When some of the flour dusted across the counter, Rosa began to laugh. It was the first time any of them had heard her laugh since their capture. The sound was startling. They all stopped and stared. "I am sorry," Rosa said, still giggling. "It is just we have flour everywhere and no one is angry. No one is worried about waste. In Germany, this much spilled flour would have been a crisis." Sarah Mitchell's eyes were glistening. "Here we have enough." They worked together, Anna and Greta offering suggestions in German that Sarah and Bennett could not understand but tried to follow through gestures and tone. Clara kneaded dough with the focused intensity of someone doing sacred work. Her hands remembered the movements from before the war, from when baking was joy instead of survival. The Apfelkuchen went into the oven and they waited. The scent that filled the kitchen was almost unbearable. Cinnamon and apples and butter and sweetness. The smell of home. The smell of everything they had lost. When Clara pulled the cake from the oven, golden and perfect, she stood holding it and cried again. Not desperate sobbing like with the butter. Quieter. Deeper. The tears of someone who had believed they would never experience this again. She cut generous slices and they sat together around the work table. Americans and Germans, guards and prisoners, former enemies sharing cake. The first bite was transcendent. Clara cried, Anna cried, Greta and Rosa cried. The cake tasted exactly like Clara's grandmother had made, like childhood, like peace, like everything the war had taken away. Sarah asked gently, "Is it bad?" No, Clara said through tears, her accent thick. "It is perfect. It is the first perfect thing in 4 years." Bennett, who had been quiet throughout the lesson, spoke up. "My mom used to make apple pie. She died when I was 12. I had forgotten what it tasted like until now." Something shifted in that moment. Some barrier dissolved. They were no longer quite so separate, no longer quite so enemy and captor. Just people who had all lost something, who all remembered better times, who all understood what it meant to taste home in a piece of cake. The cooking lessons continued every Saturday through the summer and into fall. Greta taught Sarah how to make potato pancakes. Anna shared her mother's recipe for lentil soup. Rosa, the youngest and most resistant, finally contributed a recipe for Christmas cookies her grandmother used to make. The Americans reciprocated. Sarah taught them to make fried chicken. Bennett showed them how to grill steaks. Patterson, who rarely spoke, demonstrated how to make proper American biscuits with gravy. Through food and flour and shared labor, understanding grew. Patterson began speaking to them in his broken German, apologizing for his poor grammar. Greta responded in improving English patient with his mistakes as he was with hers. They discovered they were both from farming families. Both knew about soil and weather and the hard work of growing things. Something developed between them. Tentative at first, then undeniable. In September, Greta confessed to Anna that she loved him. Anna was shocked. "He is the enemy." Greta shook her head. "Number. He is the man who gave me his jacket when I was cold, who did not punish us for eating butter, who taught me that kindness is not weakness." "They want to marry," Greta said. "He has asked me, but I need permission from the military authorities, and I would need to apply for immigration status." Anna looked at her friend, at the hope and fear warring in her face. "Do you want to stay here in America?" Greta nodded. "There is nothing left in Germany for me. My family is scattered or dead. My country lied to me about everything. But here Frank has a farm, a real future, and he wants me to be part of it." "What about you?" Greta asked. "What will you do?" Anna thought about Hamburg in ruins, about Lotte gone, about her mother dead, about the apartment that no longer existed, and the country that had betrayed them all. "I think I want to stay too," she said quietly. Captain Morrison helped with the paperwork. The immigration process was complex and slow, but Morrison had connections and knew how to navigate bureaucracy. By November, Greta had permission to marry Patterson. By December, Anna had approval to remain in the United States as a displaced person. Clara and Rosa both chose to stay as well. Clara had no bakery to return to. Rosa had finally accepted that the Germany she had believed in never truly existed. The wedding took place in early January 1946, small and simple in the camp chapel. Greta wore a dress borrowed from Sarah Mitchell. Patterson wore his dress uniform. Morrison officiated. Anna stood as witness, still amazed that this was happening. When Patterson kissed his German bride in an American chapel, something that had seemed impossible a year ago became real. The transition to civilian life was not easy. By 1950, over 2,000 German prisoners of war had chosen to stay in America. They married American women, they bought farms and opened businesses. They raised children who grew up speaking English without accents, playing baseball, eating apple pie. They became Americans not by birth, but by choice. This was the power of kindness over hatred, of abundance over propaganda. Anna worked odd jobs around Des Moines through 1946 and into 1947. She cleaned houses, she worked in a laundry, she saved every penny she could. Her English improved slowly. The Iowa accent confused her at first, but she learned to understand it and eventually to mimic it. In the spring of 1947, Captain Morrison, now retired, and simply Dorothy to those who knew her, helped Anna secure a small business loan. Anna opened a bakery on Locust Street in downtown Des Moines. She named it Golden Crust Bakery, a reference to the first white bread she had eaten on the transport ship, the bread that had made Rosa cry, the bread that had shown them all how thoroughly they had been lied to. The bakery started small, just Anna and one assistant. They made bread and simple pastries, German recipes and American ones, Apfelkuchen and apple pie, stollen and sugar cookies. food that bridged two worlds. Gradually, the business grew. Word spread about the German baker who made everything from scratch, who used real butter in everything, who never wasted a crumb. Greta and Patterson bought a farm outside the city. They had their first child in 1948, a daughter they named Dorothy after Captain Morrison. Their second came in 1950, a son they called Frank Jr. Clara opened her own bakery specializing in German pastries. She married an Iowa farmer in 1949. They rebuilt what had been lost. Rosa struggled the longest. The anger and confusion took years to process, but eventually she became a teacher. She taught German and history to high school students. She made sure they understood the dangers of propaganda and blind obedience. In the summer of 1950, before Anna left Camp Wheeler for the last time, Captain Morrison gave her a gift. It was small, wrapped in plain paper. Anna opened it carefully. Inside was a ceramic butter dish, small and simple with a tiny crack running along one edge. "This was on the table during your first breakfast," Morrison said. "I thought you should have it." Anna held the cracked dish in her hands and could not speak. "Remember where you came from," Morrison said quietly. "But more importantly, remember that people can change. That kindness matters. That the smallest gestures can reveal the deepest truths." Anna kept the butter dish like a sacred object. When she opened her bakery, she placed it on a shelf above her workspace where she could see it every day. The years passed. The bakery thrived. Anna became an American citizen in 1952. She never married. The war had taken too much. But she built a life nonetheless. A good life. A life of meaning. In 1958, Frank Patterson died of a heart attack while mending fence on his farm. He was 65 years old. The funeral was held at the Methodist church he had attended all his life. Every pew was full, farmers in their Sunday best, shopkeepers from town, former soldiers who had served at Camp Wheeler, German immigrants who had stayed after the war, their American-born children beside them. Greta stood at the front with their three children. Dorothy, age 10, named for Captain Morrison, Frank Jr., age 8, and little Margaret, age 5, named for Patterson's mother, who had starved herself to feed her children during the Depression, half German, half American, fully Iowan. Anna stood at the pulpit, her hands gripping the smooth wood. She had prepared notes but set them aside. "I met Frank Patterson on March 19th, 1945, she began. Her accent was lighter now, but still present. "I was his prisoner, his enemy, a German soldier who had fought against everything he believed in." She paused, looking out at the congregation. "I expected him to hate me. I would have understood if he had. But Frank Patterson did not know how to hate." She told them about the butter, about Greta shivering in the cold in the jacket Frank had given her without being asked, about the cooking lessons on Saturday afternoons, where he tried to speak German and she tried to speak English, and they both laughed at their mistakes. She told them about the day Frank pulled her aside after she had eaten butter by the spoonful in the mess hall, how he had shown her a photograph of his mother gaunt and exhausted, how he had said in broken German, "I remember hungry. You not enemy, just hungry." That moment changed everything, Anna said, her voice breaking. He saw past the uniform, past the propaganda, past the fact that we had been trying to kill each other weeks before. He saw a person who needed kindness, and he gave it. She gripped the pulpit harder. "Frank Patterson taught me that the opposite of enemy is not friend. The opposite of enemy is understanding." A murmur of agreement went through the church. He chose to see our humanity when he could have chosen hatred. He chose to build a bridge when he could have built a wall. And because of that choice, 4 German women found home in Iowa. Dozens of children were born who would never have existed. Kindness multiplied across generations. She looked at Greta, at the 3 children, at the congregation full of people whose lives had been touched by one Iowa farmer who had decided that understanding mattered more than revenge. "That is Frank Patterson's legacy," Anna said quietly. "Not the acres he farmed or the crops he grew, but the hearts he changed, the futures he made possible, the world he made a little bit kinder." She stepped down from the pulpit. The church was silent except for the sound of quiet weeping. They buried him in the cemetery overlooking his farm. As they lowered the casket into the Iowa soil he had worked all his life, Anna placed a small butter dish on top, cracked along one edge. A symbol Frank would have understood. Kindness planted in the ground, ready to grow. In November 1959, news reached Iowa about revolution in Cuba. Fidel Castro had seized power. People were fleeing, the same pattern repeating. War and displacement and refugees searching for safety. A church in Des Moines sponsored several Cuban families. They arrived with nothing. Donated clothes, no English. The same lost expression Anna recognized immediately. One morning in early 1960, a Cuban family entered Golden Crust Bakery. 5 people, a mother and father. 3 children. They hesitated in the doorway, uncertain if they were welcome. Anna gestured warmly, please. Sit. She brought out a tray. Fresh apple cake made from Clara's grandmother's recipe. And beside each generous slice, she placed a small dish. In each dish sat a pat of butter, golden and perfect. The Cuban mother Maria stared at the butter. She reached out tentatively to touch it, confirming it was real. Then she looked up at Anna with tears already starting. It is yours, Anna said gently in her accented English. All of it. There is more if you want more. Maria spread butter thick on her cake. She bit into it and tears streamed down her face. Her children watched in confusion. The father's jaw tightened as he fought his own emotion. Anna stood behind the counter and watched. She saw herself 15 years earlier. Saw Greta and Clara and Rosa in that moment of breaking and relief. Saw the circle completing itself. After the Cuban family left with bags of bread and pastries, Anna returned to her kitchen. The shelf above her workspace held the cracked butter dish Morrison had given her 20 years ago. She picked it up, running her finger along the familiar crack. This dish had been there during her first American breakfast. It had witnessed her transformation from prisoner to immigrant to citizen. It had seen former enemies become neighbors and friends and family. She set it back on the shelf carefully. Below it, she had placed a small, handwritten note. Never waste butter. It saved my life once. Use it to save others. By 1985, Anna was 64 years old. Golden Crust Bakery had been operating for nearly 40 years. The neighborhood around it had changed. New immigrants had moved in. Vietnamese, Cambodian, Hmong, all fleeing their own wars, all searching for safety. A local television station came to do a story about the bakery's anniversary. The camera crew set up in the corner while customers came and went. A young reporter with perfect hair and nervous energy adjusted her microphone. Tell me, she said, leaning forward, you came here as a prisoner of war. Now you run one of Des Moines' most beloved bakeries. How did that transformation happen? Anna smiled slightly. It started with butter. The reporter blinked, confused. Butter, real butter. Anna reached for the cracked ceramic dish on the shelf behind her. This dish was on the table at my first American breakfast. March 20th, 1945. I had not seen real butter in 3 years. When I tasted it, I cried. We all cried. She held the dish up to the camera, turning it so the crack caught the light. Why do you still serve butter with everything? The reporter asked. Anna set the dish down carefully. Because this butter dish saved my life. Not because it fed my body, though it did that. It saved my life because it showed me the truth. What truth? Anna looked directly at the camera, at the viewers watching from their comfortable homes, at the people who had never known real hunger or real lies. That ordinary kindness is more powerful than any propaganda. That sharing a meal can heal more than any treaty. That sometimes the enemy is not who you were told it was. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I was taught that Americans were cruel, savage, weak. Every word was a lie. They fed me when my own country starved me. They treated me with dignity when I expected brutality. They gave me a future when I thought I had none. Her accent was still there after 40 years, softening her consonants and rounding her vowels. But her message was clear. Never waste butter, she said firmly. It saved my life once. Use it to save others. The young reporter sat back, her prepared questions forgotten. Behind them, a Vietnamese family entered the bakery. Anna smiled and gestured them to a table. Excuse me, she said to the camera. I have work to do. Anna Brenner lived until 2004, passing away at age 83. Her bakery still operates today, run by the children of the refugees she fed over 40 years. They still use the cracked butter dish, displayed now in a glass case near the register. They still serve refugees who arrive in Des Moines frightened and uncertain. They still remember. This is what makes America great. Not walls, but open doors. Not hatred, but kindness. Not propaganda, but truth told over breakfast. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that enemies can become family, and a single act of kindness can echo through generations. What is your family's story of immigration reconciliation or unexpected kindness? Share it below in the comments. These stories matter. They remind us who we are and who we can be. Thank you for watching. Remember the lesson Anna Brenner learned in that Iowa prison camp in 1945. Never waste butter.